I was 24 years old when I married Michael Harrison, and I thought I had found my forever home. The scent of jasmine drifted through the church windows that September afternoon, mixing with the warm vanilla candles that flickered along every pew. My dress rustled against the worn wooden floors as I walked down that aisle, the fabric heavy with beading that caught the golden sunlight streaming through stained glass. Michael's eyes were bright with tears when he saw me, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for mine at the altar. The organ music swelled around us, vibrating through my chest, and when he whispered "I love you" just before our kiss, his breath was warm and sweet against my lips. But even on that perfect day, I felt Dorothy Harrison's cold stare boring into my back. Michael's mother sat in the front row, her silk dress the color of storm clouds, her thin lips pressed into what might have been a smile but felt more like a warning. The temperature seemed to drop whenever she looked at me, and I caught the sharp scent of her expensive perfume, something floral but bitter, like roses left too long in stagnant water. She clapped politely when we were pronounced husband and wife, but her applause sounded hollow against the enthusiastic cheers of everyone else. Michael had warned me about his mother's protective nature. "She just needs time to warm up to you," he'd said during our engagement, his fingers threading through mine as we sat on his apartment couch. The leather was soft and worn, and I could smell the faint aroma of the coffee we'd shared, mixed with his cologne, something woodsy and comforting. "She's been the only woman in my life for 32 years. It's an adjustment." I believed him then. I wanted to believe him. The hope in his voice made my chest feel light and fluttery, like butterflies dancing behind my ribs. But when Dorothy Harrison hugged me after the ceremony, her embrace was as warm as winter fog, and she whispered in my ear with breath that smelled of bitter herbs, "Welcome to the family, dear. I hope you'll be very happy." The words themselves were kind, but something in her tone made the small hairs on my neck stand up. The Harrison family home was a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, painted cream with dark green shutters that always seemed to be watching. The wraparound porch groaned under the weight of heavy wooden furniture, and the floorboards sang different notes depending on where you stepped. Michael had grown up in this house, and after our honeymoon in the mountains where the air tasted of pine and possibility, we moved into the third floor, converting what had been his childhood bedroom and a guest room into our own little apartment. Those first weeks were magical. I would wake to the sound of Michael's steady breathing beside me, his arm heavy across my waist, and the morning light would filter through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across our quilted bedspread. The smell of coffee would drift up from the kitchen below, rich and inviting, mixed with the scent of whatever breakfast Dorothy was preparing. The house had its own rhythm, its own voice. Pipes hummed behind the walls, the old radiator in our bedroom clanked to life each morning with sounds like someone tapping on metal, and the stairs creaked in a familiar pattern that I quickly learned to recognize. Dorothy was polite in those early days, but there was always something calculated about her kindness. When I offered to help with dinner, she would smile and pat my shoulder with a cold hand, saying, "Oh, that's so sweet of you, dear, but I have my own way of doing things." When I suggested redecorating our little space upstairs, she would tilt her head and purse her lips. "Well, of course, it's your home now too, but Michael has always loved his room just the way it is." Her voice was smooth as silk but sharp as broken glass, and every conversation left me feeling slightly off balance, like I'd missed something important. The house itself seemed to side with her. Doors that opened easily for Dorothy would stick when I tried them, requiring me to put my full weight behind them, leaving me slightly breathless. The shower in our bathroom had a particular way of turning on that she never bothered to explain, so I spent my first month either scalded by water hot enough to turn my skin pink or shocked by icy streams that made me gasp and shiver. The kitchen cabinets were organized in a system that made sense only to her, and every time I reached for a plate or a glass, I could feel her watching me, her presence like a chill in the room. Michael seemed oblivious to the tension. He would come home from his job at the accounting firm, his tie loosened and his shirt slightly wrinkled, smelling of copy paper and coffee, and he would wrap his arms around me from behind while I tried to help with dinner. His chin would rest on my shoulder, rough with 5 o'clock shadow, and he would hum contentedly while Dorothy moved around us with the efficiency of someone who owned every inch of space. "Isn't this nice?" he would say, his voice vibrating against my ear, "having my two favorite women taking care of me?" Dorothy would smile at these moments, but the smile never reached her eyes. Her eyes were the same shade of blue as Michael's, but where his were warm like summer sky, hers were pale and calculating, like ice forming on a window. She would set plates on the table with just a little more force than necessary, the porcelain clicking against the dark wood, and she would always seat herself between Michael and me. Dinner time became a carefully choreographed dance. Dorothy would serve Michael first, piling his plate high with the foods he'd loved since childhood: pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, mashed potatoes whipped with real butter until they were fluffy as clouds, green beans cooked with bacon until they practically melted in your mouth. The kitchen would be thick with the smells of comfort food, rich and hearty, and Michael would close his eyes and smile with the first bite, making small sounds of appreciation that warmed my heart even as they made something cold settle in my stomach. "You know, Dorothy," I said one evening, my fork poised over my own considerably smaller portion, "I'd love to learn some of Michael's favorite recipes. Maybe you could teach me?" The words felt brave in my mouth, but my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. Dorothy's fork paused halfway to her lips. She chewed slowly, deliberately, and I could hear the soft sounds of her eating in the sudden quiet. Michael looked up from his plate with hopeful eyes, and I could smell the faint scent of the wine we'd opened, something light and fruity that was supposed to make everything more relaxed. "Oh, honey," Dorothy finally said, setting down her fork with a gentle clink, "these recipes have been in the Harrison family for generations. They're not really something you can just learn from watching." She reached over and patted Michael's hand, her fingers pale against his tan skin. "They take years to perfect, don't they, sweetheart? Remember how many times you tried to make my apple pie when you were little?" Michael laughed, the sound rich and familiar, but it stung like salt in a wound. "She's right, you know. I could never get the crust right. It would either be too tough or fall apart completely." He looked at me with affection but also something that might have been pity. "Don't worry about it, babe. Nobody cooks like Mom." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I forced myself to smile, but my cheeks felt tight, and the food in my mouth suddenly tasted like sawdust. Dorothy's smile was triumphant, though she tried to hide it behind another bite of pot roast. Continua a historia. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep through the old windows and settle into my bones. The house groaned under the weight of snow, and the heating system worked overtime, filling the rooms with dry, dusty air that made my throat scratchy. Dorothy took this as an opportunity to establish new routines, ones that somehow always excluded me. "Michael, dear," she would say over breakfast, her voice cutting through the morning stillness, "I need to go through your father's papers today. You know how overwhelming all those legal documents are for me." She would sigh dramatically, one hand pressed to her chest, and Michael would immediately set down his coffee mug, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the wooden table. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you need." His voice was always so gentle with her, so protective, and I would feel something twist in my chest, part longing and part resentment. "Oh, but it's such tedious work," Dorothy would continue, her eyes finding mine across the table. "So boring for someone who didn't know Richard personally. We'll be in the study for most of the day, going through box after box of memories." The message was clear. This was family business, Harrison business, and I wasn't really family, not in the way that mattered. I would spend those long winter afternoons alone in our rooms upstairs, listening to the muffled sounds of their voices below, the occasional burst of laughter when they discovered some forgotten photograph or letter. The loneliness would wrap around me like a heavy blanket, and I would find myself standing at the window, watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains, feeling like a stranger in what was supposed to be my own home. Richard Harrison had died 5 years before I met Michael, but his presence still filled every corner of the house. His leather recliner sat in the living room, the burgundy fabric worn smooth in the shape of his body. His pipe tobacco still scented the study, sweet and woody, even though the pipes themselves were locked away in a display case. Dorothy spoke of him constantly, weaving his memory into every conversation like a protective charm against change. "Richard always said the most important thing was keeping the family together," she would announce at dinner, her voice taking on the reverent tone she reserved for his memory. "He worked so hard to build something lasting, something that could be passed down through generations." Her eyes would find Michael's face, and he would nod solemnly, as if receiving sacred instruction. "What kind of work did he do?" I asked one evening, genuinely curious about the man whose ghost seemed to rule the household. Dorothy's face lit up with the kind of joy I'd never seen her direct toward me. "Oh, he was brilliant with investments. Started with nothing and built a small fortune through careful planning and wise choices. This house, the land around it, all of it came from his hard work and dedication. She gestured around the dining room with its heavy wooden furniture and crystal chandelier that cast dancing rainbows across the wallpapered walls.
That's amazing, I said, and I meant it.
The house was beautiful, filled with antiques and artwork that spoke of generations of careful curation.
He must have been very proud of what he built.
He was, Dorothy replied, but her voice had grown cooler. And he was very specific about how it should all be maintained.
The family traditions, the way things are done.
He believed that change for the sake of change was destructive. The words felt like a warning, and Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The smell of dinner, roast chicken with herbs that made my mouth water despite the tension, seemed to grow stronger in the awkward silence that followed. It was around this time that Dorothy began mentioning the will. Never directly, never in a way that felt like a threat, but the references were constant, like water wearing away stone. Richard was so careful about his estate planning, she would say while watering the plants in the living room, the spray bottle making soft misting sounds. He wanted to make sure everything went to people who truly understood the family values. Or, while sorting through mail at the kitchen counter, the envelopes making crisp rustling sounds as she opened them, it's amazing how many legal documents you have to deal with when someone passes away.
So many decisions about beneficiaries and inheritance.
Richard spent months with his lawyer, making sure every detail was perfect. Michael would always change the subject when these conversations started, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw would clench just slightly. He would reach for my hand under the table, his palm warm and slightly damp, and squeeze gently, but he never challenged his mother's comments directly. The truth was, I didn't care about Richard Harrison's money. Michael made a good living, and I had my own job at the local elementary school, teaching second grade. I loved the chaos of children's voices, the smell of crayons and construction paper, the way their faces lit up when they finally grasped a difficult concept. My students called me Mrs. Harrison with such pride, as if they were the first to discover my new name, and their innocent joy made the coldness at home feel even more stark. But Dorothy's constant hints were wearing me down, like listening to a faucet drip in the middle of the night. The message was becoming clearer with each passing day. I was an outsider, a threat to the family legacy, someone who needed to be managed and contained.
The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in February.
Snow was falling again, heavy flakes that stuck to the windows and muffled all sound from outside. I had come home from school tired and looking forward to a quiet evening with Michael, maybe watching a movie while the wind howled around the house. Instead, I found Dorothy and Michael in the living room, surrounded by stacks of papers and what looked like legal documents. "Oh, perfect timing," Dorothy said when she saw me, but her smile was sharp as winter wind. "We were just discussing some important family business." Michael looked up from a thick folder, his face flushed and his hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Hey, babe," he said, but his voice was strained, distracted.
"Mom's been showing me some of Dad's investment portfolios. It's pretty complicated stuff."
"I'm sure it is," I said, setting my school bag by the door and unwrapping my scarf. The wool was damp from snow, and it left my neck feeling cold and exposed.
"Anything I can help with?"
The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the old house settling around us, wood creaking and pipes humming behind the walls. Dorothy and Michael exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read, but it made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Well," Dorothy said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "it's really more of a family matter.
Harrison family business, you understand."
She gestured to the papers spread across the coffee table, and I could see letterheads from law firms, bank statements, and documents with official seals.
The words hit me like a physical blow.
After months of subtle exclusions and veiled comments, she had finally said it outright. I wasn't family, not really. Not in the way that mattered when it came to decisions and money and the things that Dorothy considered important. Michael must have seen something in my face because he started to rise from his chair.
"Mom, I don't think."
"No, it's fine," I said quickly, my voice coming out higher than I'd intended.
"I understand completely."
I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, part embarrassment and part anger, and I knew if I stayed in that room another second, I would say something I couldn't take back. I climbed the stairs to our rooms with as much dignity as I could manage, each step feeling like it took enormous effort. Behind me, I could hear the low murmur of their voices resuming, Dorothy's tone soothing and explanatory, Michael's confused and defensive. The sounds followed me up the stairs like accusations. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the tears come. They were hot and angry, and they left my face feeling raw and swollen. The room was cold despite the heating, and I wrapped myself in the quilt my grandmother had made, seeking comfort in its familiar weight and the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked between the layers. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and I could hear the tree branches scraping against the house like fingernails on a chalkboard. Michael found me there an hour later. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, and then the soft click of our bedroom door closing behind him. The mattress dipped as he sat beside me, and I felt his warm hand on my back, moving in gentle circles. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. Didn't she? I turned to look at him, and his face was creased with worry and guilt. In the lamplight, his eyes looked tired, older somehow. "Michael, she's been making it clear since our wedding day that I don't belong here." Today was just the first time she said it out loud. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "She's been through a lot, losing Dad, and adjusting to having someone new in the house. She just needs more time." "It's been 6 months," I said, and my voice broke slightly on the words. "How much more time does she need? And what exactly am I supposed to do while I wait? Pretend I don't live here? Pretend I'm not your wife?" Michael pulled me against his chest, and I could smell his familiar scent, that mixture of his cologne and something uniquely him that usually made me feel safe. Tonight, it just made me feel more alone, because even his comfort couldn't bridge the gap that his mother was steadily widening between us. "Things will get better," he murmured against my hair. "I promise they will." But they didn't get better. If anything, Dorothy's campaign to exclude me became more sophisticated, more subtle, and therefore more devastating. She began planning family activities during the hours when I was at work, ensuring that I would always hear about them secondhand. "Oh, we had such a lovely afternoon," she would tell me over dinner, her voice bright with false regret. "We drove out to visit Richard's grave and then stopped by his sister's house. Margaret was so happy to see Michael. She has wonderful stories about when he was little." Or, "Michael and I went through more of his father's papers today. We found some beautiful photographs from his childhood. It's so important to preserve those memories, don't you think?" Each time, Michael would look uncomfortable, pushing food around his plate or avoiding my eyes, but he never corrected her or suggested that maybe they could have waited for me to join them. The message was always the same: the important Harrison family business happened when I wasn't around, and my absence was not only acceptable but preferred. Spring brought new challenges. Dorothy announced that she wanted to plant a memorial garden for Richard, and she enlisted Michael's help every weekend, planting and digging and selecting plants that had been his favorites. They would spend entire Saturdays outside, their voices carrying through the open windows as they worked together, laughing and sharing memories that I had no part in. I would watch from the kitchen window as I did laundry or cleaned, feeling like a voyeur in my own life. Dorothy would direct Michael to different spots in the yard, her hands gesturing expressively, and he would follow her instructions with the kind of patient attention I remembered from our early days together. She had brought him a wide-brimmed hat to protect him from the sun, and she would periodically call him over to sip from a water bottle she'd prepared with ice and lemon slices. The care she showed him in those moments was genuine and touching, and it made me understand something that perhaps I should have realized earlier. This wasn't really about me at all. Dorothy wasn't just protecting her territory or her money, she was protecting her relationship with her son, the last connection she had to the life she'd built with Richard. I was the intruder who threatened to take away the person who made her feel needed and important. Understanding her motivation didn't make it hurt less, but it did help me see the situation more clearly. Dorothy Harrison was fighting for her place in Michael's life, and she had decades of shared history on her side. I had love and marriage certificates, but she had childhood memories and family traditions and the weight of obligation that comes with being someone's mother. The realization came to me on a Saturday morning in May as I watched them working in the garden together. Michael was digging holes for new rose bushes, his shirt damp with sweat, while Dorothy knelt nearby, carefully removing plants from their containers. The earth smelled rich and loamy, and there was something primal about the scene, something that spoke to the most basic bonds between parent and child.
I made a decision that day. Instead of continuing to fight a battle I couldn't win, I would try a different approach. I would give Dorothy space to have her relationship with Michael while building my own life that didn't depend entirely on her approval. It was a form of surrender, but it was also a kind of liberation. That evening, while they were both dirty and tired from their day in the garden, I announced that I had signed up for a painting class at the community college. "It's on Saturday mornings," I said, setting a glass of iced tea beside Michael's plate. "I've always wanted to try watercolors, and the instructor is supposed to be excellent." Dorothy looked up sharply, and I could see her trying to process this information. Was this a threat to her Saturday plans with Michael, or was I voluntarily removing myself from the equation? "That sounds wonderful," Michael said, his face brightening with genuine enthusiasm. "You're so artistic. I bet you'll be great at it." "It'll be nice to have a hobby," I agreed, and I meant it. The thought of spending Saturday mornings in a bright studio, surrounded by the smell of paint and paper, focusing on something that belonged entirely to me, felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in months. Dorothy was still watching me carefully, but some of the tension had left her shoulders. "How nice," she said finally. "It's so important for everyone to have their own interests." The painting classes became my refuge. The instructor, Mrs. Chen, was a tiny woman with silver hair and paint-stained fingers who spoke in a soft voice that somehow commanded absolute attention. The studio was on the third floor of the old arts building, with tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight and the sounds of the town waking up on Saturday mornings. I discovered that I had a talent for capturing light and shadow, for mixing colors that seemed to glow on the paper. My first attempts were clumsy, but Mrs. Chen was patient and encouraging, showing me how to let the water carry the pigment, how to work with the paper's texture instead of fighting against it. "Painting is about seeing," she told me during my third class, as I struggled with a simple landscape. "Not just looking, but really seeing. The way light changes everything, the way colors speak to each other, the way empty spaces can be as important as filled ones." Her words seemed to apply to more than just art. I began to see my situation at home differently, to notice things I had missed before. Like the way Dorothy's face would soften when she thought no one was watching her look at Michael, or how she would carefully prepare his coffee each morning, adding exactly the right amount of cream and sugar without him having to ask. Or the way she would unconsciously touch Richard's photograph when she passed it in the hallway, her fingers tracing the glass as if she could somehow reach through and touch him again. She was lonely, I realized. Profoundly, desperately lonely in a way that my presence in the house only made more acute. I represented everything she had lost: youth, romance, the promise of being the most important woman in her son's life. Fighting me wasn't just about protecting her territory, it was about staving off the reality that life was moving forward without her husband, that her role as the center of Michael's world was naturally diminishing. This understanding made me feel more compassionate toward her, but it also made me more determined to protect myself. Compassion didn't require me to accept mistreatment, and loneliness didn't excuse cruelty. I began to document the small slights and exclusions, not because I planned to use them against her, but because I needed to validate my own experience. When someone systematically undermines your reality, it's easy to start questioning your own perceptions. Summer brought a heat wave that made the old house feel like a furnace. The air conditioning system, installed sometime in the 1970s, wheezed and struggled against temperatures that climbed into the high 90s day after day. Dorothy took to spending her afternoons in the coolest room of the house, the old study where Richard's presence still lingered in every book-lined corner. It was there, on a particularly sweltering day in July, that I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had come home from school early, dismissed because the building's air conditioning had failed completely. The heat outside was oppressive, making the air shimmer like water, and even the short walk from my car to the front porch left me feeling dizzy and sick. I let myself in quietly, grateful for even the marginal coolness of the house's interior, and headed straight for the kitchen to get something cold to drink. That's when I heard their voices drifting from the study, low and urgent in the way that indicated serious conversation. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about Dorothy's tone made me pause at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting on the banister's smooth wood. "She's never going to fit in, Michael," Dorothy was saying, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I've tried, God knows I've tried, but she's just not Harrison material. She doesn't understand our ways, our values.
"Mom, that's not fair," Michael replied, but his voice lacked conviction.
"She's trying. The painting classes, staying out of family business when you asked her to." "Exactly."
Dorothy's voice rose slightly, then dropped back to a whisper. "She runs off to her little art classes instead of trying to be part of this family. And when we discuss important matters that will affect all of us, she acts like she's being excluded instead of understanding that some things are private."
I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation.
The painting classes that had been my salvation, my way of giving her space while maintaining my sanity, were being used as evidence of my failure as a wife and daughter-in-law.
"What are you suggesting?" Michael asked, and I could hear the wariness in his voice.
Dorothy's next words fell into the hot, still air like stones into water. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to consider whether this marriage was a mistake."
"You're still young, Michael.
You could start over, find someone who shares our background, our understanding of what family means." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they would hear it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds, each sound loud as a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. "I love her, Mom," Michael finally said, but his voice was small, uncertain. "I know you think you do," Dorothy replied, and her tone was gentle now, persuasive.
"But love isn't always enough, sweetheart. Your father and I, we loved each other, but we also understood each other. We wanted the same things, valued the same traditions.
That's what made our marriage work for 43 years. I heard a chair creak, the sound of someone shifting position, and then Dorothy continued.
"I've been thinking about the inheritance, about your father's wishes for the estate.
He was very specific about keeping everything in the family, about ensuring that his legacy would be preserved. If you were to, well, if circumstances were to change, it would make everything so much simpler."
The implication hit me like a physical blow.
She wasn't just talking about Michael leaving me, she was talking about the money, about cutting me out of any claim to the Harrison estate. The will, the careful legal planning she'd been hinting about for months, it was all designed to ensure that if I divorced Michael, I would walk away with nothing. "I need to think about this," Michael said, and his voice sounded hollow, defeated. "Of course, darling," Dorothy replied.
"Take all the time you need. But remember, some opportunities don't come around twice.
You're at a crossroads, and the decisions you make now will affect the rest of your life." I heard footsteps moving toward the study door and quickly, quietly, made my way up the stairs to our bedroom. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me, and I felt sick to my stomach, as if I'd been punched in the gut. The room felt stifling, the heat pressing down on me like a weight, but I was shivering anyway.
Dorothy wasn't just trying to exclude me anymore.
She was actively working to end my marriage, and she was using Michael's inheritance as leverage. The family money that she'd been dangling like a carrot for months was really a stick, a weapon to beat me with until I gave up and went away.
That night, Michael was distant and preoccupied.
He picked at his dinner, barely responding to my attempts at conversation, and when we went to bed, he lay on his side with his back to me, claiming he was too hot to cuddle. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around us, wondering if he was seriously considering his mother's suggestion. The next morning, he left for work without his usual kiss goodbye, muttering something about an early meeting. Dorothy was humming in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast, her voice light and cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. She looked up when I entered, her smile bright as winter sun. "Good morning, dear," she said, setting a cup of coffee in front of me. "You look tired.
Are you feeling all right?"
The false concern in her voice made me want to scream, but I forced myself to smile back. "Just the heat," I said. "It's hard to sleep when it's this hot." "Oh, I know exactly what you mean," she replied, turning back to the stove where she was scrambling eggs in a pan that hissed and popped.
"Michael's always been sensitive to heat too.
When he was little, I used to put wet washcloths on his forehead to help him sleep on nights like this." Another memory I wasn't part of, another story designed to remind me that she had decades of history with him while I had barely 2 years. I sipped my coffee and tried to think of a response that wouldn't sound bitter or resentful.
"That was thoughtful of you," I managed.
"A mother does whatever she can to take care of her child," Dorothy said, and though she was still facing the stove, I could hear the smile in her voice.
No matter how old they get, they're still your baby.
I'm sure you'll understand that someday. The words were casual, conversational, but they hit me like a slap.
Someday.
Not if you have children with Michael, but someday, as if she knew something I didn't about my future. As if she knew that my time in this house, my time as a Harrison, was limited. I finished my coffee in silence and left for work, but I couldn't concentrate on my lesson plans or my students' needs. The second graders could sense my distraction, becoming restless and chatty in the way children do when the adult in charge isn't fully present. By lunchtime, I had a headache that felt like someone was driving nails behind my eyes. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home after school, I drove to the office of James Morrison, the lawyer who had handled my grandmother's estate when she died. Mr. Morrison was a kind man in his 60s with gentle eyes and a reputation for discretion, and I knew I could trust him to give me honest advice. His office was in one of the old buildings downtown, with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The smell of leather-bound books and aged paper filled the air, and the late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in golden light. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, rising from behind his massive oak desk to shake my hand.
"What can I do for you today?"
I took a deep breath and told him everything. About Dorothy's constant exclusions, about the conversation I'd overheard, about my fears that Michael might be considering divorce and that I would be left with nothing. Mr. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing more serious as my story unfolded. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, thinking carefully before he spoke. "What you're describing sounds like a pattern of systematic alienation," he said finally.
"The question is, what kind of legal protections do you have?" We spent the next hour going over my options.
As Michael's wife, I had certain rights to marital property, but the Harrison estate was largely inherited wealth that predated our marriage. If Michael chose to divorce me, and if Dorothy had indeed structured Richard's will carefully, I might walk away with very little beyond my own possessions and whatever assets Michael and I had acquired together. "The good news," Mr. Morrison said, his voice gentle but frank, "is that you're thinking about this before any divorce proceedings begin. If you're genuinely concerned about your husband's intentions, there are steps we can take to protect your interests."
"What kind of steps?" I asked. "Documentation, for one thing."
If there's a pattern of emotional abuse or manipulation, that could be relevant in divorce proceedings.
"Financial records, evidence of any attempts to coerce your husband into ending the marriage, witnesses to inappropriate behavior."
He paused, studying my face carefully.
"Are you prepared for that kind of investigation? It could get very unpleasant, very public." The thought made my stomach churn, but I nodded. "I just want to know where I stand," I said. "I want to be prepared for whatever happens."
Mr. Morrison made more notes, then looked up at me with something that might have been sympathy.
"There's one more thing to consider," he said.
"If Mrs. Harrison is as determined as you say she is, she may escalate her efforts.
People who are used to getting their way don't usually give up easily when they encounter resistance."
His words proved prophetic sooner than I expected.
August brought Dorothy's masterstroke, a plan so carefully orchestrated that I almost had to admire its devious brilliance.
It began with what seemed like an olive branch, an invitation to join her for lunch at the country club where she and Richard had been members for 20 years. "I've been thinking," she said over breakfast one morning, her voice carefully casual as she buttered a piece of toast, "that you and I should spend some time together, just the two of us.
Get to know each other better."
She looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though I had learned to distrust her smiles.
"Would you be free for lunch on Saturday? I thought we could go to the club. I'd love to introduce you to some of the other wives." Michael's face lit up with hope and relief. "That's a great idea, Mom," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand.
"You two will have so much to talk about once you really get to know each other." I wanted to refuse, every instinct screaming that this was some kind of trap, but I couldn't think of a way to decline without seeming unreasonable. "That sounds lovely," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice.
"I'd like that very much."
The country club was exactly what I expected, old money trying to pretend it was older than it actually was. The building was designed to look like an English manor house, complete with ivy-covered walls and mullioned windows, but it had been built in the 1950s, and the effect was more Disney than Downton Abbey. The dining room was filled with women who looked like older versions of Dorothy, all carefully styled hair and conservative clothes that probably cost more than I made in a month. Dorothy was in her element here, greeting other members with air kisses and practiced smiles, introducing me as Michael's wife in a tone that somehow managed to sound both proud and slightly apologetic. The other women were polite but distant, sizing me up with eyes that had been trained from birth to identify social hierarchies and proper bloodlines. Lunch itself was surprisingly pleasant. Dorothy ordered wine, a crisp white that tasted of summer afternoons, and she regaled me with stories of the club's history, pointing out founding members' portraits on the walls and explaining the significance of various traditions. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed relaxed, genuinely enjoying herself, and I began to think that maybe, just maybe, we might actually find some common ground. That feeling lasted until dessert, when Dorothy's expression suddenly shifted, her face taking on the look of someone who had just remembered something important and distressing. "Oh, my goodness," she said, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of surprise that seemed just a little too theatrical. "I just realized I forgot to mention something rather awkward that came up this week." My fork paused halfway to my mouth, a bite of chocolate mousse balanced on the tines. Something cold settled in my stomach, and I had the distinct feeling that I was about to walk into whatever trap she had been preparing. "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Dorothy looked around the dining room as if checking to make sure no one was listening, then leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Well, you know how close-knit this community is, how people talk." She paused, giving me a meaningful look. "Margaret Stevens, you remember Margaret, Richard's sister, she mentioned that she'd heard some rather concerning rumors about you." The chocolate mousse turned to ash in my mouth. "Rumors?" "Oh, you know how these things get started," Dorothy said, waving her hand dismissively while her eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Someone sees something innocent and misinterprets it, and before you know it, the whole story has been blown out of proportion." "What kind of rumors?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew exactly where this was heading. Dorothy sighed deeply, as if the burden of having to share this information was almost too much to bear. "Well, apparently someone saw you having lunch with a man who wasn't Michael. Multiple times. At that little cafe downtown, the one with the outdoor seating?" She tilted her head, studying my reaction. "Margaret said her friend Janet mentioned it, and Janet is usually very reliable about these things." For a moment, I was genuinely confused. I ate lunch at the cafe downtown several times a week. It was close to the school, and they made excellent sandwiches, but I couldn't think of any occasions when I'd been there with a man other than Michael. Then realization dawned, and I almost laughed with relief. "Oh, you mean David Chen," I said. "Mrs. Chen's son from my painting class. He's a teacher too, at the high school, and we sometimes meet for lunch to talk about art techniques and classroom management." I shook my head, smiling at the absurdity of it. "He's gay, Dorothy, and he's been with his partner for 10 years. There's absolutely nothing romantic about our friendship." I expected her to look embarrassed, maybe even apologetic for bringing up such obviously baseless gossip. Instead, her expression hardened, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or innocent misunderstanding. This was deliberate. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice taking on a tone of concern that sounded practiced, rehearsed. "Because Margaret said Janet was quite specific about what she saw. Intimate conversation, lingering touches, the kind of body language that suggests more than friendship." "That's ridiculous," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see how carefully Dorothy had set this up. She hadn't just repeated gossip, she had created it, fed it to Margaret through her friend Janet, knowing it would eventually make its way back to her so she could present it to me as innocent concern. "I'm sure it is," Dorothy agreed, but her tone suggested the opposite. "The problem is, once these rumors start circulating, they take on a life of their own. People begin to wonder, to watch more carefully, to interpret everything through that lens." She reached across the table and patted my hand with fingers that felt cold as ice. "I thought you should know, so you could be more careful about appearances. For Michael's sake, if nothing else." The threat was clear. She had started rumors about my fidelity, and if I didn't fall in line, if I didn't back away from Michael voluntarily, she would escalate them. She would make sure the whispers grew louder until they reached Michael's ears, until he began to doubt me, to question every innocent interaction I'd ever had with another man. I pulled my hand away from hers, fighting the urge to throw my water glass in her face. "You're right," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I should be more careful. Thank you for letting me know." Dorothy smiled, the expression warm and grandmotherly, as if we'd just shared a lovely heart-to-heart about recipes or gardening. "I'm so glad we had this talk," she said. "I feel like we understand each other so much better now." The drive home was a blur of fury and desperation. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, and I had to pull over twice to catch my breath when the anger threatened to overwhelm me completely. Dorothy hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. She was willing to destroy my reputation, to spread lies that could damage my career and my marriage, all to get what she wanted. When I got home, I found Michael in the study, reading over some documents that looked suspiciously like legal papers. He looked up when I entered, and I could see something guarded in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. "How was lunch?" he asked, but his tone was carefully neutral. "Enlightening," I replied, studying his face. "Your mother shared some interesting community gossip with me." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did she?" "She did." I sat down across from him, noting how he shifted the papers he'd been reading so I couldn't see them clearly. "Michael, we need to talk. About your mother, about our marriage, about what's really going on in this house." For a moment, I thought he might actually open up, might finally acknowledge the poison that had been seeping into our relationship for months. But then he glanced toward the doorway, as if checking to make sure Dorothy wasn't listening, and his expression closed off completely. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Everything's fine." Those 3 words, "everything's fine," told me everything I needed to know. Michael had made his choice, and it wasn't me. Whether he believed his mother's manufactured rumors or was simply too weak to stand up to her manipulation, the result was the same. I was alone in this house, in this marriage, in this battle. That night, I called Mr. Morrison from my cell phone, standing in the backyard where I was sure Dorothy couldn't overhear. The evening air was thick with humidity and the sound of crickets, and fireflies blinked lazily among the rose bushes that Dorothy and Michael had planted together. "She's escalating," I told him without preamble. "Just like you said she would. She's spreading rumors about me having an affair." Mr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Can you prove they're false?" "The man she's talking about is gay," I said. "He's been with his partner for a decade." "But that doesn't matter, does it? The damage is in the rumor itself, not in whether it's true." "Unfortunately, you're right," he replied. "But this might actually work in your favor if it comes to divorce proceedings. If we can prove she's deliberately spreading false information to damage your reputation and your marriage, it could be considered alienation of affection." "What do I need to do?" "Document everything," he said. "Who she talked to, when, what exactly was said. If you can get any of it in writing, emails, text messages, anything, that would be ideal. And start thinking about witnesses, people who can testify to your actual relationship with this David Chen." After I hung up, I stood in the garden for a long time, breathing in the scent of roses and listening to the sounds of the summer night. The house loomed behind me, its windows glowing with warm yellow light, and for a moment it looked like the perfect family home it was supposed to be. But I knew better now. I knew what lurked behind those pretty facades, what kind of poison could masquerade as maternal love and family loyalty. Dorothy Harrison wanted a war, and she was about to get one. September brought a heat wave that refused to break, leaving the air thick and oppressive day after day. The old house creaked and groaned under the temperature, and tempers grew short in the stifling atmosphere. Dorothy's campaign against me had intensified since our lunch at the country club, but she had grown more subtle, more careful about her methods. The rumors she had planted were doing their work. I began to notice sidelong glances from other teachers at school, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the faculty lounge, invitations to social gatherings that mysteriously never materialized. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, called me into her office one afternoon with a concerned expression that made my stomach clench with dread. "Sarah," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, "I wanted to talk to you about something that's come to my attention." The office smelled of coffee and the vanilla candles she kept burning to mask the building's perpetual mustiness.
"I've been hearing some talk around town about your personal life." My face flushed hot with embarrassment and anger. "What kind of talk?"
Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she didn't have to have this conversation. She had been my champion when I was hired, praising my dedication to the children and my creative teaching methods. Now she looked like she was preparing to deliver bad news. "The kind of talk that could become problematic for the school," she said finally.
"Parents talk, Sarah.
They share gossip at soccer games and PTA meetings, and some of them have expressed concerns about having a teacher whose marriage might be unstable."
The euphemism hung in the air between us like smoke. Unstable.
Not failing because of a manipulative mother-in-law, not crumbling under the weight of systematic psychological warfare, but unstable, as if I were somehow defective, unable to maintain proper domestic harmony. "My marriage is fine," I lied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth.
"Whatever people are saying, it's not true."
Mrs. Patterson nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "I hope that's the case," she said. "Because I'd hate to see this affect your position here. You're a good teacher, Sarah, but this is a small town, and reputation matters." I left her office feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Dorothy's poison was spreading faster than I had anticipated, seeping into every corner of my life. She wasn't just trying to destroy my marriage anymore, she was going after my career, my ability to support myself if Michael did decide to leave me.
That evening, I confronted Michael directly.
I found him in our bedroom, packing a suitcase with clothes for a business trip to Chicago that would keep him away for 3 days. The sight of him folding shirts and selecting ties felt like a reprieve, 3 days without having to navigate the minefield that our home had become. "We need to talk about your mother," I said, closing the bedroom door behind me and leaning against it. Michael paused in his packing, a tie hanging forgotten in his hands.
"What about her?"
"She's spreading rumors about me, Michael.
Lies about me having an affair. It's affecting my job, my reputation, everything."
I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to talk to her, to make her stop." For a moment, something flickered across his face, guilt, maybe, or recognition of the truth in what I was saying. But then his expression hardened, and I saw his loyalty shift back to where it had always been. "Mom wouldn't do that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction.
"She's not that kind of person." "Isn't she?"
I moved closer to him, desperate to make him see what was happening.
"Michael, think about it. How else would these rumors have started? Who else knew about my lunches with David Chun? Who else would have reason to want me discredited?"
Michael turned away from me, focusing intently on folding a pair of pants.
"Maybe you're being paranoid," he said. "Maybe people are just noticing things you don't realize you're doing."
The words hit me like a slap. He was suggesting that maybe the rumors were true, that maybe I was having an affair and was too caught up in it to realize how obvious I was being. After 2 years of marriage, after all the times I had told him I loved him, after all the ways I had tried to fit into his family, he was willing to believe I was capable of betraying him. "You don't trust me," I said, and it wasn't a question.
Michael's hands stilled on his suitcase.
"I don't know what to think anymore," he admitted quietly. "There's so much tension in this house, so much conflict. Maybe some time apart would be good for us."
"Time apart," I repeated. "Is that what this business trip is really about?"
He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. He finished packing in silence while I stood there feeling like the world was shifting beneath my feet. When he was done, he turned to face me, and I could see something that looked like pity in his eyes. "I think," he said carefully, "that we both need to consider what we really want from this marriage." The words were diplomatic, careful, but their meaning was clear. He was giving me an ultimatum: find a way to make peace with his mother, or lose him. There was no third option, no possibility that he might choose me over her, that he might recognize what she was doing and put a stop to it.
After he left for the airport the next morning, the house felt different.
Dorothy was still there, humming in the kitchen as she prepared her solitary breakfast, but without Michael as a buffer between us, the air crackled with unspoken hostility. I ate my cereal in silence, listening to the sounds of her moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who owned every inch of space. Michael seemed a bit tense this morning, she observed, pouring herself a second cup of coffee.
I hope everything's all right between you two.
The false concern in her voice made my teeth clench. Everything's fine, I replied, echoing Michael's words from weeks earlier. I'm glad to hear it, Dorothy said, but her smile was sharp as winter frost. Marriage can be so challenging, especially when there are external pressures.
External pressures. Like mothers-in-law who spread malicious gossip and manipulate their sons into questioning their wives' fidelity. But I didn't take the bait.
Instead, I finished my breakfast and left for work, determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing how deeply her campaign was affecting me. That afternoon, I made a decision that would prove to be either brilliant or catastrophic, depending on how the next few days unfolded. Instead of going straight home after school, I drove to the house of Janet Morrison, the woman Dorothy had mentioned as the original source of the rumors about my supposed affair. Janet was a widow in her 70s who lived in a neat bungalow on the other side of town, surrounded by flower gardens that were the envy of the neighborhood. I had met Janet several times at community events, and she had always seemed like a kind, straightforward woman who valued honesty above social niceties. If anyone would be willing to tell me the truth about how these rumors had started, it would be her. Janet invited me in for tea, her manner warm but curious about this unexpected visit. Her living room was comfortable and unpretentious, filled with handmade quilts and photographs of grandchildren, and it smelled of lavender and old roses. I hope you don't mind me asking, I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries, but I've heard that you might have seen me having lunch with someone downtown, and I wanted to clear up any misunderstandings. Janet's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Well, she said slowly, I'm not one to spread gossip, but I did mention to Margaret Stevens that I'd seen you with a young man several times. You seemed very friendly.
David Chen, I said. He's a colleague of mine, and he's gay. We talk about teaching and art, nothing more.
I leaned forward slightly, studying her face.
Janet, can I ask you something? Did Margaret ask you specifically about me, or did you bring it up yourself? Janet's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down. Well, now that you mention it, she did ask.
Said she'd heard something and wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual.
She paused, thinking. Come to think of it, it was a bit odd. Margaret's not usually one to fish for gossip like that. Do you remember exactly what she asked?
She wanted to know if I'd seen you with any men other than Michael, and whether you seemed intimate with anyone.
Janet's cheeks flushed slightly.
I told her about the young man at the cafe, but I made it clear that I hadn't seen anything inappropriate.
Just two people having lunch and talking. And how did Margaret react to that? Janet frowned, clearly beginning to see the implications of what she was telling me.
She seemed almost disappointed, she said slowly. Like she'd been hoping for something more dramatic. She looked at me with growing concern. My dear, I hope I haven't caused you any trouble. I never meant to suggest there was anything improper going on. You haven't caused any trouble, I assured her.
But I think someone has been using your innocent observations for purposes you never intended. I left Janet's house with my suspicions confirmed.
Dorothy hadn't just repeated existing gossip, she had actively solicited it, coaching Margaret Stevens to ask leading questions that would produce the kind of responses she could then twist into evidence of my supposed infidelity. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, using the natural human tendency to see scandal where none existed and the small-town propensity for gossip to create a narrative that served her purposes. That evening, alone in the house with Dorothy, I made my second crucial decision. Instead of confronting her directly, which would only alert her to how much I knew, I decided to set a trap of my own. If she was going to play dirty, then I would have to match her tactics. I called David Chen and explained the situation, asking if he would be willing to help me document what was really happening.
David was outraged on my behalf and immediately agreed to assist in any way he could.
We arranged to meet for lunch the next day at the cafe downtown, but this time, I would be prepared with my phone's recording app ready to capture any conversation that might follow. The next morning, Dorothy seemed unusually cheerful, humming as she prepared breakfast and commenting on how nice it was to have some quiet time in the house. I played along, agreeing that the peace was lovely, all while my nerves jangled with anticipation of what the day might bring. At lunch, David and I had our usual conversation about teaching techniques and upcoming art projects, but I made sure to keep my phone positioned to record everything. True to form, David regaled me with stories about his partner's latest adventures in home renovation, making it abundantly clear to anyone listening that he was completely uninterested in women romantically. What I didn't expect was for Dorothy herself to appear at the cafe. She walked in about 20 minutes into our lunch, dressed in her best church outfit and wearing the kind of smile that could cut glass. David's back was to the entrance, so he didn't notice her immediately, but I saw her the moment she stepped through the door, her sharp eyes scanning the room until they found us. "Sarah, darling," she called out, her voice carrying across the cafe with theatrical surprise. What a lovely coincidence! Every head in the small restaurant turned toward us, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. This wasn't a coincidence at all. Dorothy had planned this, probably having someone call her the moment I arrived at the cafe. She wanted witnesses, an audience for whatever performance she was about to give. David turned in his chair, and I quickly introduced him to Dorothy, watching her face carefully as she processed his obviously gay mannerisms and speech patterns. For just a moment, I saw confusion flicker across her features, as if she was trying to reconcile the rumors she had created with the reality of the effeminate young man sitting across from me. "How lovely to meet you," Dorothy said, extending her hand to David with the kind of gracious smile she reserved for public consumption. "Sarah's mentioned you several times." "All good things, I hope," David replied with his characteristic warmth. "Sarah's been such a wonderful friend. She and I have so much in common: teaching, art, the challenges of dealing with difficult family members." He winked at me conspiratorially, not realizing how loaded his innocent comment had become. Dorothy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly. "How nice that you found such a good friend," she said to me. "Michael will be so pleased to know you're not spending your lunch hours alone." The implication was subtle but clear to anyone paying attention. She was making sure everyone in the cafe understood that I was married, that this lunch companion was noteworthy enough for my husband to be informed about. She was simultaneously trying to fuel the rumors while covering herself by appearing supportive of my friendship. "Actually," David said, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation, "I was just telling Sarah about my partner Jerome's latest project. He's renovating our guest bathroom, and you wouldn't believe the tile samples he's brought home. Our house looks like a ceramic showroom exploded." Dorothy blinked, the word partner clearly registering. I watched her face carefully, seeing the moment when she realized that all her carefully constructed rumors were built on a foundation of sand. David wasn't my lover. He was gay, committed to another man, and completely uninterested in me romantically. "How nice," she managed, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was already calculating how to adapt her strategy, how to pivot from this particular line of attack to something else. "Well, I don't want to interrupt your lunch," Dorothy said, her voice regaining its artificial sweetness. "I just wanted to say hello. Sarah, I'll see you at home this evening." After she left, David looked at me with raised eyebrows. "That was your mother-in-law?" he asked. "The one who's been making your life miserable?" "That's her," I confirmed, watching through the window as Dorothy climbed into her car with movements that suggested barely controlled fury. "She seemed almost disappointed to meet me," David observed. "Like she was expecting someone different." "She was," I said grimly. "She was expecting someone who could serve her purposes." That evening, Dorothy was waiting for me in the living room when I got home from school. She sat in Richard's old chair, her posture perfect and her hands folded in her lap, looking like a queen preparing to hold court. The late afternoon light streaming through the windows cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the thin line of her mouth. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. I set down my school bag and faced her, my heart hammering but my voice steady. "Do we?" "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dorothy continued, her tone carefully modulated. "About your friendship with that young man, and about some things that may have been said around town." "What kind of misunderstanding?" Dorothy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, clearly I was given incorrect information about the nature of your relationship.
Anyone could see that your friend is, well, that he's not interested in women that way.
She was backing down, trying to retreat gracefully from her failed gambit, but I wasn't going to let her off that easily. Not after the damage she had already done to my reputation and my marriage.
What exactly were you told? I asked. And by whom?
Oh, you know how these things work, Dorothy said with a dismissive wave. Someone sees something, tells someone else, and before you know it, the story has changed completely. It's like that old game, telephone, where the message gets garbled as it passes from person to person. Except in this case, I said, taking a step closer to her chair, the message was deliberately crafted to make me look like an unfaithful wife. Someone asked leading questions, gathered selective information, and then spread it around town in a way that would damage my reputation. Dorothy's face went very still. I'm sure I don't know what you mean.
Don't you?
I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app, showing her that it was running.
Because I have a very clear recording of my lunch conversation with David today, one that makes it obvious he's gay and completely uninterested in me romantically.
I also have detailed notes from my conversation with Janet Morrison, where she explained exactly how she came to share her observations about my lunch meetings, and with whom. The color drained from Dorothy's face, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely rattled.
You recorded our conversation at the cafe?
I recorded my lunch with David, I corrected.
You chose to insert yourself into it.
Just like you chose to manufacture a scandal where none existed, to spread lies about me in an attempt to destroy my marriage.
Dorothy stood up abruptly, her composure cracking. You have no idea what you're talking about.
I know exactly what I'm talking about, I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. I know that you've been systematically trying to turn Michael against me since the day we got married. I know that you've been excluding me from family activities, undermining my place in this house, and spreading malicious gossip to isolate me from the community. I know that you see me as a threat to your relationship with your son, and you're willing to destroy my life to eliminate that threat. Michael is my son, Dorothy said, her mask finally slipping completely. He's all I have left of Richard, all I have left of the life we built together.
I won't let some little gold digger waltz in here and tear apart everything we worked for. Gold digger? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Dorothy, I have a job. I support myself. I've never asked Michael for money, never tried to get my hands on Richard's inheritance.
All I wanted was to be part of your family, to build a life with the man I love. You wanted to take him away from me, Dorothy shot back, her voice rising. To fill his head with ideas about moving out, starting fresh somewhere else. I've seen how you look at this house, at our traditions, like they're obstacles to overcome instead of treasures to preserve. The raw pain in her voice caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw past her manipulation and cruelty to the frightened, lonely woman underneath. She really did see me as a threat, not just to her control over Michael, but to her entire sense of identity and purpose.
I never wanted to take him away from you, I said more gently.
I wanted to add to your family, not subtract from it.
Liar, Dorothy spat.
You wanted to replace me. To become the most important woman in his life and push me aside like some kind of outdated relic. We stared at each other across the living room, two women fighting for the same man's love but from completely different perspectives. She saw it as a zero-sum game where my gain had to be her loss. I had naively believed there was room for both of us in Michael's heart.
It doesn't have to be this way, I said finally.
We could find a way to coexist, to both be important to Michael in different ways. Dorothy shook her head, her expression hardening again.
No, she said. We couldn't.
Because you'll never understand what this family means, what Richard built, what Michael represents. You're an outsider, and you'll always be an outsider, no matter how long you stay married to my son.
The words hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down.
There would be no peace treaty, no negotiated settlement. One of us would win this war, and the other would lose everything. Then you'd better be prepared for a fight, I said quietly.
Because I'm not going anywhere.
Dorothy smiled, and this time it was genuine, cold as winter moonlight but utterly real.
Neither am I, dear. Neither am I.
The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of armed truce. Dorothy was icily polite, speaking to me only when necessary and treating me like an unwelcome houseguest who had overstayed her welcome. I responded in kind, going through the motions of domestic life while planning my next moves in what had become an open war.
Michael returned from his business trip on Friday evening, looking tired and subdued.
I met him at the door, hoping against hope that time away had given him perspective on what was happening in his own house. Instead, he seemed more distant than ever, hugging me briefly before immediately seeking out his mother to share the details of his trip. That night, as we lay in bed with the carefully maintained distance that had become our norm, I tried one more time to reach him. "Michael," I said quietly, "I know things have been difficult lately, but I want you to know that I love you. I love you, and I want to make our marriage work." He was quiet for so long I thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless.
"I love you too," he said. "But love isn't always enough, is it?"
The words were an echo of what his mother had said to him weeks earlier, and I realized with dawning horror that Dorothy had won. She had poisoned him so thoroughly against me that he was already preparing to let me go. The rumors, the exclusions, the systematic campaign to make me feel unwelcome in his home, it had all worked exactly as she had planned. I turned away from him, tears burning my eyes, and stared out the window at the dark garden below. Tomorrow, I would have to make the most difficult decision of my life, whether to keep fighting for a marriage that was already over, or to cut my losses and walk away with whatever dignity I had left. But first, I had one more card to play. One last desperate gamble that might expose Dorothy's true nature and give Michael a chance to see what he was really choosing between. If it worked, I might save my marriage. If it failed, I would lose everything.